Let me introduce shortly Professor Dr. Bart Wallet. He is a professor of early modern and modern Jewish history, in particular of Amsterdam, and he is co-editor-in-chief of Studia Rosenthaliana, which is a very interesting publication about the history of the Jews in Holland. And he is an editor of the European Journal of Jewish Studies. And he is also one of the editors and authors of Reappraising the History of the Jews in the Netherlands. It's the most recent general history of the Jews in the Netherlands. And if you want to be up to date, buy it. He has published extensively on subjects related to the history and culture of Dutch Jewry, and he has been appointed a professor very recently. So congratulations, Bart.
Thank you so much.
And how did your inauguration go?
Well, it's COVID times, right? Or it seems in the Netherlands we are acting now as if it's over, but of course it isn't. But I was appointed full professor at the University of Amsterdam from the 1st of September last year. And back then they asked me, when do you want to give your inaugural lecture? And I said, well, let's do it in March 22, hoping that by then it would be possible to give a public lecture with like the audience present. But last January, they contacted me again, the faculty, and said, are you really sure you want to do it? Because if you proceed, we think only a limited number of people will be able to be present. And then I decided to postpone to the 26th of October. So my lecture is still in waiting, and it will be later this year. So due to COVID, we have to wait a bit. But of course, it's mostly in academics, and it's not even an obligation to give this lecture because your professorship starts du moment you're appointed. So I'm working at full speed, and in the meantime, I'm reflecting on what great topic I will decide upon for the lecture.
Yes. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where does your interest in Jewish history come from? And do you have a special interest in Sephardic history, or is it more Judaism in general?
Yeah. Well, my story with Jewish history goes back quite far, at least until I was 14 years old, when I ended up in a local archive in a little town somewhere in the Netherlands, the town of Nijkerk. And it happened, I was there on a vacation, staying over there, and I already knew I wanted to be an historian, but I had never ever been in an archive. So I thought, let me go to the local archive to do, I don't know, research maybe. So I entered the archive as a little teenager, and the archivist was quite surprised, of course, to see me. And but he was very kind and asked me, like, what do you want to do here? Is there any history in particular that might be of interest to you? And then I said, well, I'm curious after Jewish history. Do you have something? And he said, yes, of course. So he brought a whole pile of papers, of historical documents on local Jewish history, and I was excited, of course, to be able to touch real historical material and to read through it. And when I was doing this, someone entered the room, and he appeared to be the chairman of the local historical association. And he was looking, and he said, like, boy, what are you doing? That's very interesting. If you want, you may write an article for our journal. on this subject, since no one has done it before. Of course, I did. I immediately wrote 3 articles for the journal, and from that moment on, I never ever stopped doing research and writing on Jewish history. And the Nijkerk case actually is a very interesting one and a fascinating one. I didn't know, of course, when I started, because historically this started as the only synagogue that is founded by Italian Jews in the Netherlands. Originally it was an Italian synagogue, and later on an Ashkenazi synagogue was founded next to it. In the beginning of the 19th century, the Italian synagogue disappeared, and what remained was a Sefer Torah brought in from Venice, and it was donated to the Ashkenazi synagogue, and so that's where all ended up in the end. But historically, this is the only Jewish community with Italian roots in the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. So that's when that's how it started, and then I decided to study both in the history department and in the Hebrew and Jewish Studies department, from that moment on, Jewish history is my specialism, and I've never been out of the field ever since.
Right. What were the topics that you researched in the past? You have a long career already in Jewish studies. So.
Yeah. Well, my first big research was on the first half of the 19th century. Since I was intrigued by the textbook that was at the market back then, published in 1995, it read that, we don't know so much about the Jewish community of the beginning of the 19th century in the Netherlands, since this was a community that was no longer allowed to use the Yiddish and the Portuguese tongue, and was not able yet to use Dutch. And therefore, we don't know much about the beginning of the 19th century. That was the line of argument, and indeed, the chapter on the beginning of the 19th century was very poor, as there was little research done, and it was claimed that there were no sources. So I thought, that can't be true. An entire community for almost 50 years, we don't have archival documentation. So I searched for myself, and I found out that there was a huge archive, but not with the Jewish community, and not at regular places where you would suspect it, but in the national archives. And this was because the Jewish community in the Netherlands from 1814 until 1870 was formally a part of the structures of the Dutch state. So it was formally integrated into the state, being dependent on the Ministry of Religious Affairs, and the ministry appointing the chairpersons of the community. And so all archival material, more than 40 meters, was in The Hague. And that's what I studied, and that became my first book, New Dutchman, on the integration of Jews in Dutch society, 1814-1851. Now, there's a very interesting Sephardic element in there. As you might know, Sephardim in the 19th century and up until today, they compose some 5% of Dutch Jewry. So 95% is Ashkenazi, and only 5% is Sephardic. Now, in this period from 1814 until 1870, because they were under state control, the state didn't want multiple Jewish communities. They only wanted one Jewish community. So one denominational structure which all Jewish communities, whether following the Sephardic rite or the Ashkenazi rite, adhered to. That was their idea. So it was an integrated community. Now, when I studied the records of this Supreme Committee heading the Jewish community, I found out that although Sephardim were only 5% of the community, they always had the most prestigious positions. They were the chairpersons of the community. They didn't outnumber the Ashkenazim, but they were represented much more than you would suspect on their demography. And when I tried to understand this, I saw that actually the Ashkenazim often wanted Sephardim to be in the leading role, because this was good for the looks in society. If you had Sephardim, and preferably the few Sephardim of ennobled families, well, these were persons that could represent the Jewish community in society and in relations to the Dutch government, in an excellent way. And this could, of course, change the idea, which was still very dominant in the 19th century, of Jews as mostly poor people, uncivilized people, speaking the Yiddish jargon, not able to behave properly according to 19th century bourgeois standards. Well, if you had Sephardim, then you could really have a representation in society that was even above standard. So there is a Sephardic model created. So it's not only that Sephardim were in the leading roles, but as well that Ashkenazim tried very much to be, in some sort of way, Sephardim, because the idea was Sephardim had created a model of, on the one hand, adhering to halachic Judaism, and on the other hand, live an integrated life in society, participating in society without problems. And this combination, that was what actually a lot of Ashkenazim were looking for. So they looked to the Sephardic case and they wanted to mimic Sephardim. And this is very interesting. For instance, when there comes a question, a halachic question, is it allowed on a Jewish cemetery to have images on the matzevot, on the tombstones? Now, the Ashkenazi practice was in the Netherlands that it was not allowed, except for a few ritualized symbols. The symbol for the Kohanim, the symbol for the Levim, etc. But that's it. But then Sephardim in this board argued, well, it's very common for us. Just come to Oudekerk Cemetery and you will see there are beautiful images on the tombstones. And you wouldn't suggest that we are not halachically Jewish and not behaving according to halakha, since we have esteemed rabbis. So if it's permitted for Sephardim, it should be permitted for Ashkenazim as well. And especially more Ashkenazi Jews who obtained better positions in Dutch society and wanted to show this to the non-Jewish audience as well. They used this Sephardic path in order to create their own integrated, but still orthodox, halachically Jewish lives.
2 years ago, the the Dutch state of Jewish studies was in decline. There was a professorship in Leiden entitled Hebrew and Jewish Studies, but that one was abolished. And now you are joining Irene Zwiep, the one professor of Jewish and Hebrew Studies that was left. And also last year, Jessica Reutemann was appointed as Professor of Jewish Studies at the Vrije Universiteit of Amsterdam. It looks to me that Jewish history is experiencing a revival in the Netherlands. Do you agree?
At least in Amsterdam, it is, and we are very privileged. I'm really grateful as well for the position the University of Amsterdam has taken here, since they have argued that Jewish history and Jewish studies are not only integral to the city of Amsterdam, but also to the University of Amsterdam. And as I think all of you know, in Amsterdam, the most important Hebrew and Judaica collections on the European continent are based. The Eitz Chaim Library, the Bibliotheca Rosenthaliana, the collections at the city archives, the collections at the Institute of International Social History. And so there are huge Jewish studies collections in Amsterdam. And of course, you need scholars as well who are able to do research into this. And the University of Amsterdam, at least, has seen that this is important to invest in. And luckily, students are also quite enthusiastic, and we are really doing well as a department, attracting students not only from the Netherlands but also from abroad, across Europe, and even from Israel and the United States. Now, the state of the field at all the universities outside of Amsterdam is a bit different, and this has to do with, on the one hand, Jewish studies positions were often based in departments of theology and religious studies. And as you might know, secularization is quite dominant in the Netherlands. So theology departments are closing down and they are restructuring, which also means that Jewish studies is often one of the first to positions not to be continued. And so that, for instance, was the case at Leiden University. Whereas at all the universities, sometimes it's based in a department of Middle Eastern studies, where Arabic or Islam studies becomes more important, and then Jewish studies is also on the losing side. And so I would say the picture in the landscape in the Netherlands is quite mixed, but in Amsterdam we are really privileged to have some sort of hub for Jewish studies.
Yeah, will it function as a hub? Will you be working together with Irene Zwiep and Jessica Reutemann?
Yeah, of course. So Irene Zwiep is my closest colleague. So we do a lot together. So we initiate projects together, but we also teach together. We co-supervise PhD students. So we are really a team. Jessica Reutemann, of course, she is at the other university. In Amsterdam, we have two universities, the University of Amsterdam, the historic university, and the Vrije Universiteit, which used to be a Protestant university. That's where Jessica is based. And she is in a theology department. So the profiles are a bit different, but of course we cooperate and we work together. And she is very strong, especially in the transatlantic diasporic relations of Sephardic Jews, whereas Irene and me, we are more specialized in from the late 18th century onwards, the 19th century and the 20th century. And so we really complement each other in our expertise.
Which writers about Jewish history do you admire, and how are they an inspiration for you?
Wow, that's a great question, and it could also be a lengthy question. Now, let me tell you, my dissertation, to your surprise, to your dismay, of course, was not in the field of Sephardic studies, but hardcore Ashkenazi. My dissertation was on 18th century Yiddish history writing. And the most important author I studied was Menachem Mann ben Shlomo Halevi Amelander, who published a Yiddish history book, Sheirit Israel. And this was like he presented it as a continuation of Sefer Yosipon, the pseudo Josephus from the 10th century in Italy, and but he wrote a continuation in the 18th century, and it's a marvelous book in the sense that in the 18th century, someone, an Ashkenazi Jew, assembling scholarship from both Jewish and non-Jewish sources, Ashkenazi and Sephardic sources, and trying to write a balanced Jewish history book, which in a way is really a first since centuries that he did so. I would say in some sort of way, he is a source of inspiration for me already. He's not an academic historian, by far not, but the drive to tell Jewish history and to be fair to your sources, both Jewish sources and non-Jewish sources, to combine them, to weigh them. I see that already happening at this 18th century book. Now, as we move more to modern scholarship, there's of course a lot of scholars I'm inspired by and working with, mostly of course scholars dealing with Dutch Jewry, Josef Kaplan, Daniel Svetsinski, Jonathan Israel. So these are people I know intimately. Then there is there's Marion Abtroot, professor of Yiddish at the Heinrich Heine Universiteit, and I work a lot with her as well. But more broadly, there are a few international figures I think that stand out. And for the early modern period, I would name David Ruderman. It's always a pleasure as well to read his books and his material with my students, because it's always challenging for them. And in just a few pages, he is able to open up whole new worlds for his readers. And for the modern period, I would mention David Myers, presently at the Center of Jewish History in New York, because what he is doing, he brings in a philosophy of history in the field of Jewish history. And I think that's very inspiring, and it helps us as well to reconceptualize the field as such. So a few names.
Yes, thank you. Let's turn to history. In 1795, the Netherlands were conquered by the French, and they had some freedoms. They had their own parliament. And in 1796, all the Dutch were declared equal, including Jews. How did the Jews in the Netherlands react to this?
Well, actually, it's already in 1795 that there is a general declaration of the equality of all citizens in the Netherlands. But then there is a question: does this general declaration also relate to the Jews? And quite on, especially on local levels, there are progressive societies who don't want to open up their membership for Jews, for instance. So at that moment, there is confusion in society. Are Jews included in the whole concept of Dutch citizenship, or are they a foreign nation? And doesn't this new law relate to them? In order to clarify this, Amsterdam, a couple of Amsterdam Jews founded a lobby group. You could say like Jewish Life Matters at the end of the 18th century. They were activists who wanted to change the status of Jews in society, and they organized a campaign. They mobilized as well a non-Jewish support, and they mobilized this campaign in order to pressure the new parliament to discuss this case. And what they wanted is that this new parliament declared that what was the case for Protestant and Catholic and all other kinds of citizens also related to the Jews. Now, Parliament accepted the question and had a lengthy debate about it. And it's really intriguing to read this through, since you can see how Jews were perceived at the time. On the one hand, they were perceived as staunch adherents to the House of Orange, which was ousted to England. They were the enemies. The Jews were perceived as in some sort of way, as a fifth column of the House of Orange in the Netherlands. And that would be a reason not to give them citizenship. Others argued for Christian religious reasons. Well, the Jews are a nation of their own, and they should remain a nation, because in the end of times, they will have some sort of nationhood again. And if we integrate them into society, they will simply disappear. So we don't want them to integrate. But in the end, Parliament takes a very principled resolution and says citizenship is open for any human being. Jews are human beings. They live in the Batavian Republic, so this should extend to them as well. And therefore, on the 2nd of September 1796, it was decided the second country in the world after France, Jews are equal citizens. Now, most Jews, except for this lobbyists of this circle of progressive Jews, most Jews were not waiting for this to happen, especially leadership, rabbis, Nasim, they were not in favor of this change of their status, because this meant that the old structures of the Jewish nation would be dissolved, and that the Jewish community had to reinvent itself as only a religious denomination. And that anything relating to ethnicity or national identity, Jewish national identity, was no longer fit to be part of an integral Jewish identity. And so therefore, there was quite some opposition. And for that reason as well, it took quite some time before Jewish communities, local Jewish communities, were reconciled with this new idea. And basically, it's only in 1814 when the House of Orange comes back. And initially, the Jewish community thinks, like, especially the rabbis and the leadership, aha, now the House of Orange is back, so we return to the pre-emancipation period. And that's what most people want. But when the new king, William I, says, no, I'm not going to change anything, this is what I want, the community accepts. And that's a moment, from that moment on, you could say the emancipation is no longer a point of discussion, at least not within the Jewish community. And from that moment on, it's all about the implementation and the implications of being a citizen, meaning the change of language, for instance. And now let me give you one example from the Portuguese community in Amsterdam. And for the Portuguese community in Amsterdam, use of the Portuguese language, of course, was very important, not so much for day-to-day affairs. At the end of the 18th century, a lot of Portuguese Jews were already using French or Dutch. But Portuguese was still the official language used in the community, and for instance, for drashot, for sermons held in the Esnoga in Amsterdam. And for a very long period, as like the Portuguese, they like their traditions. In that sense, they are just like the British. They never ever change anything, so everything is still the same. And new things are added to it, but you don't change what is already there. So the drashot until 1852 were given in Portuguese, but no one in the community, except for the Dashanim, the ones who were preaching, no one understood Portuguese anymore. At the end, there was only one man who was still born in Portugal, who was able to follow the Portuguese language drashot. So what happened is, when the drasha started, all men left the synagogue. And as you know, the Portuguese synagogue has a courtyard. So they went to the courtyard to have a drink, to discuss. And the one man remained seated in the synagogue, in Snoga. And he listened. And when it was over, he came out and he said, "Come in, we continue." Well, this was, of course, quite frustrating for the Dashanim, because they made beautiful drashot, sermon, but no one listened, actually. And so it's in 1852, it's changed finally into Dutch as the new language. So it takes quite some time before changes are made in Jewish communities.
Yes. Back to French times. In the beginning, the Dutch had some liberties, had their own parliament, but in 1806, the Netherlands were incorporated into the French Empire. And they got themselves a king, Lodewijk Napoleon, a brother of Napoleon. And he already nudged Ashkenazim and the Sephardim towards a closer cooperation. And after him, like you mentioned, King William I forced them to work closely together. And the Hoofdcommissie der Zaken tot de Israëlieten, a commission composed of the most important persons from the Ashkenazic and Sephardic community. Did King William succeed, and was there more cooperation and maybe even integration between those two branches of Judaism, or did they continue like they did before?
Like as I said before, the Ashkenazim, they liked it. They loved to have the Portuguese on board and be one community with them, and they gave the Portuguese all the prominent positions they wanted. But to be honest, the Portuguese were not thrilled by this whole idea. They considered it to be a loss of their identity, as they were, of course, the first Jewish community in the Netherlands, in the sense, not only the first in terms of time, but also in terms of like importance. They were the historic communities. Now, the idea was, it was not that synagogues had to fuse together. So within the Esnoga and the other Portuguese synagogues across the Netherlands, because it's not only in Amsterdam, but also in The Hague, in Naarden, in Rotterdam for some period of time. And there were other Portuguese synagogues. So they could proceed, and they also had their own boards, the Panasim still functioning, but they were integrated into the larger framework of a united Jewish denominational structure. At some time, this also related to the Jewish communities in the Caribbean. So the Jewish communities in Suriname, I think it's after 1825-26, and the Jewish community of Curaçao, they are also integrated into this structure. They from that moment on, they also had to adhere to all the decisions taken by this Supreme Committee that was in charge of the Jewish community. Now, you could argue that even though it's a united it's a united community, one denominational structure, that in fact there were still like two streams within it, each having their own nusach, their own communities, and also their own educational structures. So there was a seminary for the Sephardic community, and there was a seminary for the Ashkenazi community. But, for instance, when examinations were being held, there were always mixed committees. So a rabbinic committee with Sephardim and Ashkenazim, for instance, seeing if someone from the Portuguese community, for instance, met all the requirements to become a full rabbi. And so they had to cooperate. Now, in 1848, the year of the revolutions across Europe, also the Netherlands get an adaptation of the constitution, and in the constitution changes, at least in this sense, that from this moment on, the government can't any longer interfere in religious communities, which means that the Jewish community has to become independent from the state. Now, from 1848 until 1870, the Jewish community was quarreling how to organize this. And the quarrel was mainly this: Ashkenazim arguing we have to remain together with the Sephardim, and the Sephardic community of Amsterdam claiming, no, we want to become independent again. We want to have our own Portuguese denomination. And the Sephardic community of The Hague, however, wanted to remain in the unitary structure with the Ashkenazi. And this, of course, has to do with the Sephardic community of The Hague being much smaller and much more dependent on collaboration with the Ashkenazi, whereas the Amsterdam community was big enough to have its own structures. But in the end, Amsterdam won, and from 1870 onwards, there are two denominations: the Ashkenazi Orthodox denomination on the one hand, and the Portuguese Israelite denomination on the other hand. And the community of The Hague, although they didn't want this solution, they had to simply accept the lead taken by Amsterdam, and they formed the Portuguese denomination together. So I would say it's a mixed result. The Sephardim did pretty well in these united structures. They had a prominent position, but it was not ultimately not their liking. They really wanted to become independent again, and as soon as this was possible, they did so. And that's still the situation as it is right now.
Yes. Can you see the Sephardic identity or the way Sephardim looked at themselves changing during this period?
Yeah, absolutely. I think most of us present here will be very familiar with the argument for the early modern period, meaning that Sephardic identity, Western Sephardic identity, is very much a kinship-based economic family networks across port cities, including the Atlantics. And this was quite a successful network. In some sort of way, you could argue that although people lived in Amsterdam or Hamburg or London or New York, the most prominent location was Sephardic diaspora. And that's where they moved where they found their wedding partners, where they had their economic activities, etc. And most scholars argue that at the end of the 18th century, or somewhere during the 18th century, and I relate to Joseph Kaplan and to Jonathan Israel, they would argue this network is falling apart in the 18th century. And then, of course, with the rise of nationalism in the 19th century, it's almost gone. Now, I would argue they are right for as far as regards economy, absolutely. And so the economic network doesn't survive at the beginning of the 19th century and the Napoleonic era, etc. But in the 19th century, and I think that's also the reason why in the 19th century ultimately the Sephardim don't want to to remain in this structure with the Ashkenazim. Sephardic identity becomes more of an historicized identity. It becomes an historical identity, and it means that if you belong to the Portuguese community in Amsterdam, you have to be proud of your history. So you can't be proud anymore of your riches, of your wealth, of your cultural achievements. But what you can be proud of is history. So in the 19th century, Amsterdam Sephardim start celebrating their history with events as like the Jubilee of the synagogue, starting documenting the history of Beit Chaim, of the cemetery at Oude Kerk. People start collecting books and material on the history of the community. And so the history itself becomes a very important element in constructing Sephardic identity. And this historical identity also connects Amsterdam Sephardim with Sephardim in Hamburg, in London, across the Caribbean, and in the United States, in Canada. When you see that other communities, they celebrate something, or for instance, the synagogue in Hamburg goes in fire, the Amsterdam community is going to help. They are going to send presents if there are celebrations elsewhere, and also if they have a celebration in Amsterdam, like the former daughter community or communities or sister communities, they also send presents. For instance, London is sending a Pontero when the Esnoga is celebrating its centenary, or like by tricentenary already. And so all communities, like there's this historic connection that unites diaspora. I think in that sense, from the 19th century onwards, much more so than economy and family relations, they don't disappear, but history becomes a very important element in being a Sephardic Jew.
How did Dutch Sephardic history, how do you compare it within the wider Sephardic community? Was Dutch Jewish history different from Jewish history elsewhere? Was the backwater or?
Well, of course, yeah, that's an important question. As especially in the early modern period, as Gérard Nahon has argued, Amsterdam was a metropole, une métropole, one of the central cities in the Western Sephardic Diaspora, where other communities turned to in case there were problems that needed to be solved. And the Amsterdam Beit Din had a prominent position, not just for the local community, but for the wider diasporic network. Now, in the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, this changes somewhat. Of course, London becomes much more important. A lot of other communities are acting more independently. But if you trace, for instance, if you look at the graduates of Eitz Chaim, at the seminary in Amsterdam, and Eitz Chaim was not only training rabbis, but also Melamedim, Chazanim. And I've done some research in the archives of the Amsterdam community, the Portuguese community, and you find letters from across the Sephardic diaspora, from historic communities like Shearith Israel in New York, or from Montreal in Canada, from Curaçao, but also from new communities, from Caracas, for instance, or in Latin America. And they write to Amsterdam and they say, like, we need a rabbi, we need a melamed, we need a teacher, we need a chazan. Do you have someone at Eitz Chaim? Could you send us someone? So in the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century even, Amsterdam still was delivering religious professionals for Sephardic diaspora. And I find it always intriguing, the story of Abraham Lopez Cardozo. And I'm sure some of you know him. He was the last, I think, the last one symbolizing this. He was trained in Amsterdam at Eitz Chaim. He became first a chazan and a teacher in Suriname. Maybe he also had been in Curaçao. I'm not sure. No, I see Ron. It's not Curaçao. But finally, he ended up in New York, being the chazan of Shearith Israel, and functioning until the end of the 20th century. Now he is the last one, but he symbolizes his trajectory was quite common in the 19th century. There were, in the beginning of the 20th century even, there were a lot of these people trained in Amsterdam and then hopping from one Sephardic community to the other. In that sense, the Western Sephardic diaspora was still functioning. People were still traveling within this whole diasporic network. Because why? If you wanted someone in your community familiar with the nusach and with the traditions of the Sephardic community, the Western Sephardic style. And the training institution for a very long time was Eitz Chaim, was Amsterdam. So in that sense, Amsterdam is still having a role, maybe no longer like le métropole, as in the early modern times, but still it has a vital role in this whole network of Western Sephardic communities.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the history of Ashkenazim needs to be written.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I know several people who are thinking about it, but they are only thinking about it. And if anyone wants to, I will be able to assist.
Yeah.
Did Sephardim have any role of importance in 20th century Netherlands before and after the war?
I would say on an individual level, Sephardim in the Netherlands, both from The Hague and from Amsterdam, have had prominent roles in Dutch society, in Dutch politics, at universities, as intellectuals. But if you look at the Jewish community, you will see that, of course, the Sephardic community, because it became an independent denomination after 1870, became a junior partner to the dominant Ashkenazi community in the Netherlands, which comprised 95%. And you must know that until the beginning of the Second World War, or even after the Second World War, Reform Judaism was not really an option in the Netherlands. And so you were either, if you were Ashkenazi, you were a member of the Ashkenazi community; you were Sephardic, you were a member of the Portuguese community. It was as simple as that. And only German Jews fleeing to the Netherlands, they introduced Reform Judaism. Well, good for them. But a proper Dutch Jew, until at least the 1950s, would not associate himself with Reform Judaism. These are the two. In a way, you could say the Ashkenazi community more or less has the monopoly over, like, who has the say in what is the representation of the Jewish community in society. But if there were shared initiatives, for instance, there is a Dutch branch of the Alliance Israélite Universelle in the Netherlands, then you will still see this reflect. If there is a Sephardi, preferably from an ennobled family, and this person wants to be the chairperson, he definitely will be the chairperson. So there is still this, you could say, Sephardic privilege going on. And Sephardim, they get, because they are Sephardim, quite nice positions within Jewish institutions. After the Second World War, there's a whole debate if there is a future for an independent Sephardic community in the Netherlands, and because it was already quite small before the war, some 5,000 people. It became even smaller, of course, after the war, some 800 people. And the Ashkenazi community after the war immediately was arguing, well, of course, there's no future for you, so simply become part of us, become part of the unitary denomination once again. And that's not what happened, because the leadership of the Portuguese community, and most notably the Chacham, anyone in the Portuguese community still calls this person the Chacham, Salomon Rodrigues Pereira. His idea was that respect to the people who perished was reconstructing the community as it used to be, not changing anything. Here you have, again, this historic identity. Sephardic identity is not something to creatively work with and dynamically develop over time. No, it's an historic identity, and everything has to be the way it used to be. And that's the huge project of Chacham Rodrigues Pereira. That's what he wants. and therefore he declined the offer to become part of this unitary structure with the Ashkenazim, and until he passed away in the late 1960s. This was how the Portuguese community was guided, and it's only after his death that the community has to rethink, and then most people in the board, they argue, well, we don't think that there is really a future for our community, and actually we are quite afraid that the community will dwindle down, and ultimately our great historic treasures will be taken over by others, by Ashkenazim, or even worse, by Reform Jews, and that's something we don't want. And that's one of the main incentives why they argued in the 1970s, beginning of the 1980s, that to bring the Eitz Chaim Historic Library to Israel. The idea was that the library is already going to Israel, the library is making Aliyah, and the last members thereafter will also make Aliyah. And if there is a continuation of Amsterdam Sephardic history, it will be in Israel. Now, history is full of surprises, and one of the surprises is, at least, that in the 1980s, the community was successful to reconstruct itself, continue, and even in the late 1990s to bring the library back from Jerusalem to Amsterdam. Even more reinforcing the idea that this community is an historic part of the Netherlands. It's an historic identity, and that's the reason why it should be here, and we should cherish it here.
One last question for me, and if you have time, I would like to give our public the chance to put questions to you.
My pleasure.
What will be the focus of your future work?
Well, my professorship is specifically directed at the history of Jews in Amsterdam. There are several things I want to do, but one of the things I want to do is to work more on the 18th century, as there is a lot of scholarship on the 17th century with great scholars. Some of the names have already been mentioned, but many more could be added. Stephen Nedler, a lot of very fine scholars working on the 17th century, and the 18th century therefore is still full of surprises, I think. It's a very important century because it's this period of history that that Amsterdam Jewry developed into the largest Jewish community in Europe. Nowhere else there were more Jews living in one city. So this is giving Amsterdam a unique flavor, both in the Sephardic world and in the Ashkenazi world, but also having quite an impact on the position of Jews in Amsterdam society. So one of the things I want to do is to work more on the 18th century, and of course it's very helpful that now the notary deeds are being digitized and OCR'd, and even though it's only 5% that we have right now, but it's still such a rich source, and I'm already discovering stories and elements of stories that are so unique that this is really what the Germans would say, ein Fundgrube. There's so much in it to ultimately reconstruct the role of Amsterdam in the Jewish world in the 18th century.
Thank you. David, are there any questions in chats?
Well, I have a question that in England in the sort of 1840s, the rise of the reform movement was the big sort of engine of change, and yet there seems not to have been one in Amsterdam. Is there any reason for that?
Of course, the rise of the West London synagogue, it was much feared in Amsterdam because, of course, in Amsterdam they followed what was happening in sister communities like London, Bismarck, and this was a huge fear that this might happen in Amsterdam as well. Now, Dutch Jewry in general and Sephardim in particular, they developed a model of their own, which was their winning model. And the idea was that communities, including the rabbinate of the communities, remained Orthodox. So you have Orthodox communities, meaning everything within shul, within the synagogue, is going according to halakha. The rabbis are absolutely kosher. But they have no say whatsoever about the individual lives of members, meaning that from this one Jewish community, people can be members that are very strict, very frum, to people that are very free and barely participating, but they are all treated equal within the community. They are all become board members, for instance. They all get their Aliyah La Torah, and they can't be censured in any way for how they live or how they eat or whatever. And the result is often that the boards of the Amsterdam Portuguese community, for instance, most members are not Orthodox at all, are not living an Orthodox life at all. Chairmen are not living an Orthodox life, but they adhere the Orthodox identity of the community as such, and they support the Orthodox rabbi of the community. Now, this is working quite well until the 1950s, and it's only thereafter that, due to a variety of factors, Reform Judaism is becoming more successful among Dutch Jews. But until then, it is not. And Amsterdam, like the Amsterdam rabbi at the time, Aaron Mendes Trumentero, they really try to keep the Orthodox identity as it is, and they believe that the Sephardic model of integrating, on the one hand, participating in society and in culture, and having an Orthodox identity is the winning model. They really believe.
Yeah. Thank you. There's a question from Susan sort of on the same subject. I'm not really sure if you can answer it. She says, my question was, why do Sephardic Jews not like Reform Judaism? There's a major interest in Sephardic Judaism, for example, in the Reform synagogues along the US Atlantic seaboard.
Yeah. What I can say, at least from the perspective of the Amsterdam Sephardim, is that they perceived Reform Judaism as a deviation from historic Judaism, and for them, and even, of course, this Reform movement started even more so in Ashkenazi communities. So it was, according to them as well, an Ashkenazi problem. It was something, even maybe you could say, disease of the Ashkenazim. So, and they were very proud, except for London, but in most other, well, in Curaçao it goes wrong as well at some moment, but at least in most Sephardic communities, they are successful to keep everyone together with this formula of like moderate, some sort of moderate orthodoxy. But of course, you're very right that Reform Judaism is intrigued and inspired by Sephardic Judaism. Because Sephardic Judaism is also for Reformed Judaism in the 19th century and later on a role model in developing a less rigid, more integrationist understanding of Judaism. Sephardic Judaism is absolutely very much on the table for Reformed Jews, but not the other way around.
Yes, I mean, we're complete hypocrites. Even in London, we say that reform is a Tudesco issue, nothing to do with us, which is of course complete nonsense.
Yeah.
But Bernard, you've got your hand up. Do you want to unmute?
I have indeed. Yeah, thank you very much for some very interesting answers. And in fact, you have partially answered the question that I was going to ask, which fits in with this switch of identities between Sephardic, Ashkenazi, and Reform. And it was about the process of secularization within the Jewish community. And I'm guessing that the period that you're going to be focusing on, the 18th century, is probably the one in which it really gained momentum. So perhaps you can say something about that. And I have one very specific question, which is, you started off by saying that the community or the current communities are something like 5% Sephardic and 95% presumed, well, 95 minus the Reform Ashkenazi, to the extent that people identify. And I wondered if you could say at what time historically the numbers more or less became equal. And one very specific question, you started off talking about your experience in the Nijkerk archives. And I have a family line, goes back to, I think, fairly proud and prominent Ashkenazi family by the name of Turfreier. But Schoontje Turfreier, born around the end of the 18th century, married somebody called Nijkerk. And I wondered whether or not the adoption, and it looks from what I've traced back of them, that they were probably Ashkenazim and from Worms. But I wondered if you can say something about the adoption of the Nijkerk name and whether it continues as a name. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That's a lot of questions. I'm going to try to answer them all. To start with your last question, indeed, Nijkerk is an Ashkenazi surname. And that relates to the fact that next to the Italian community, an Ashkenazi community was formed. The Nijkerk family are people who moved from Nijkerk to Amsterdam, and in Amsterdam they became mentioned like those folks from Nijkerk, and that's when they adopted this last name. So that's definitely an Ashkenazi name indeed. Although the heritage of the Italian community is still preserved now by Ashkenazi community of Amersfoort. They still have a Sefer Torah from Italy, from this historic community, which is fascinating. I think it's Pasul. They won't use it anymore, but it's there. Then the question of secularization, and that's a huge debate. My dear colleague Shmuel Feiner from Bar Ilan University has written this book, Origins of Secularization, and he argues indeed that it's in the 18th century that it all starts. Now there's a huge debate on how to define secularization and secular. Has this to do with intents or with acts? And mostly Shmuel Feiner would say it's mostly about acts. And so if people don't keep kosher, or they keep kosher at home, but they go to a cafe and have a non-kosher drink. So they're acting, and he would argue this is a secularizing development. Whereas other scholars would argue, no, people can act in some way, but still adhere to the overall structure. And this is not a secularizing tendency, because for a secularizing tendency, you must have the some sort of ideology of a secular identity. And then you can discuss if the 18th century is maybe a bit too early even for such a thing. So this is a debate that is ongoing right now among scholars, and there's no conclusive answer to give to it. But it's absolutely a very important debate, and intriguing debate as well. In some related as well to the impact of the Sabbatean movement in Jewish communities, that this would have had a secularizing outcome. And as you might know, in the beginning of the 18th century, the Amsterdam Portuguese community had a crypto-Sabbatean chief rabbi, Solomon Ayalon. He was a Sabbatean, even in the beginning of the 18th century. And so it's the 18th century is fascinating in that sense. Now your final question, help me. There was one more.
The first question was the point at which numerically the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim became more or less equal.
Yeah. So if we take the city of Amsterdam, you could briefly say in the 17th century the Sephardim are demographically dominant, and in the 18th century, from the beginning of the 18th century onwards, the Ashkenazim take over. And at the end of that century, it's, let's say, 20,000 Ashkenazim in Amsterdam, and maybe some 4,000 Sephardim, more or less. That's only the city of Amsterdam. But if you take the Netherlands as a whole, it's 5% Sephardim, mostly in Amsterdam, in The Hague, and a few scattered across the remainder of the country, and 95% Ashkenazim.
Thank you.
Thank you. But before we go to Fran, I have quite a trivial question. You said that in 1852 there was only one member of the congregation who understood what was being said in Portuguese. Do you know that person's name?
No, I don't. No. I know I've done some research after the first darshan who was an activist for preaching in Dutch, Aaron Cohen Caroljon. And this guy, a fascinating person. He had to give these drashot in the Esnoga all the time, and he was frustrated that no one understood it. So he somewhere writes that there is this one guy, he is also a translator, and there's in 1832 he is invited to a court case in Middelburg in Zeeland, and he arrives there, and he is there over Shabbat, and he says to the Ashkenazi community over there, well, I'm the darshan of the Portuguese community of Amsterdam. I have an excellent sermon, and I would love to give it in Dutch at your synagogue. And the Ashkenazi community says, well, we have a Sephardic preacher over here, of course. We would love to have it, have this person. So they accept, and so he gives the Dutch version of his Portuguese sermon, and he even publishes this. And this is the first publication of a sermon, of a drasha in Dutch in the Netherlands. And it's a fascinating document, since it demonstrates how he developed this whole argument, and how it translates from Portuguese to Dutch, and etc.
Okay, thank you. Fran, you have a question?
It's more of a comment. Because I grew up in a Sephardi family in Manchester, Didsbury, I feel very much that we don't look at the anarchy that took place. My father was Ashkenazi, but they were all in South Africa, some of them racist, some of them not. But in Manchester, I grew up in a family with my grandfather who, I've said this before, he prayed all day and he didn't speak to me because I was a girl. My grandmother had her children had affairs in Switzerland with a very beautiful cousin. Now, I saw it was a very healthy growing up for me because I saw this wild, somewhat anarchic, practical life going on, which taught me to hop it and to become a theatre director or try to, which was not very popular as a notion. But nevertheless, I remember the Sephardim yelling at each other and yelling at me. I've said this before. Have you got a boyfriend? I just glared back. I mean, the actual practicalities of all this are absolutely sometimes hilarious, sometimes terrifying. And I think we need to know this drama, because I am a theatre maker, the drama of culture that goes on between those communities. I'm sure everybody's experienced it, actually. I think it's really valuable because when we talk about the sectarianism, the separation, I mean, I bet that in Amsterdam there were very wild things going on, and people being very angry about it and having amazing arguments and then disappearing down the rabbit holes and doing what they wanted to do. And I think that's really important in communities. I've done lots of work in Asian communities using theatre, and I've seen this. I'm very careful with it. I know that you don't sit there and say blather because you're doing a collective workshop, but you see the sort of creative and enraged and happy and complicated variety of these things. And I mean, so when I do sort of theatre, this whole sort of almost conflict between history and actual life is very interesting.
I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. And I can only say, go to the archives and you will find a lot of like affairs and conflicts and machlakot within the community. Absolutely.
Yes, thank you. I really have enjoyed what you've done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bruce, would you like to unmute?
Yeah, really. Professor, thanks so much. Congratulations on your professorship. Greetings from Stanford, where we know from professors. I wonder with the intensity of your research, and I don't have Bernard or others on the call's background, but can you highlight some of the factors within the Amsterdam community, which is where my mother's family comes from, that they made them want to leave Amsterdam to go to America? You know, why in the 17 and 1800s? What were the major forces within Amsterdam that kept them, you know, or propelled the Sephardic community to a lesser degree, Ashkenazi, but Sephardim to want to migrate? What were those migration factors?
Yeah, that's really an excellent question. I would say for the 17th and 18th century, this still has very much to do with this kinship-based economic networks. So on the one hand, if you had to marry off your kids, you looked, of course, in the local community, but you also looked across the Sephardic diaspora, and you asked family members elsewhere. For instance, in Curaçao, maybe do you have a good shidduch for our kid, and that's how things worked at the time. And then there is like economic networks in the sense that these businesses want to expand, but also they want to have at all their hubs people they trust, and people you trust most, of course, is your own family members. So you send your family members all the time across the Western Sephardic diaspora. So it's not uncommon to have the parents living in Amsterdam, one of the sons taking over in Amsterdam, another living in London, another in Hamburg, another in Newport, yet another in the West Indies, in Curaçao or Jamaica. Actually, that's quite common. Now, in the 19th century, there's a lot of poverty in Portuguese community. And a lot of Portuguese Jews, and then of course the question is, until like the late 1860s, the economic conditions in Amsterdam are not great. So a lot of people leave. After 1870, it goes much better in Amsterdam. So there are no reasons, economic reasons to leave anymore. But before then, they leave, and then it's really important. A lot of poor people are leaving the Netherlands at the time. You have a lot of Dutch people going to Michigan, for instance, and to Canada. But where do Dutch Sephardim go to? They go to communities where there are already Sephardic communities. So they go to London, they go to New York, to Newport, to Rhode Island, like all these communities where there are historic historic Sephardic communities. And I found a letter from the London community to the Amsterdam community at some time saying like, please stop sending your poor people to us. We don't want them anymore because they are a burden for our community. And so, of course, at this time, communities have to take care of their poor. And the Amsterdam community can't cope with their poor anymore. So they are really glad if they go abroad to UK or to the USA or to the Caribbean, just go away. But at some moment, these communities say, Amsterdam, please don't send your people anymore. It's too much.
Thank you.
It's quite a contrast. Sorry, David. It's quite a contrast to the Fintas conversation that we hear so often from Ton, that everybody's a merchant and doing well and contributing, when in fact that may not have been the case all the time.
It's part of the story, indeed. Yes.
Thank you, and of course that's how my family arrived in London. They were just too poor and just put on the banana boat and sent across. Thank you. It's been absolute tour de force, and it was really enjoyable meeting, and we hope to see you again in the future. Before Ton closes the meeting, I'm happy to tell you that next week we are welcoming Tony Pittock and Marina Delfos to talk about the Sephardic cemeteries in Jamaica, which is obviously a meeting we've been waiting for some time. So many thanks, everybody. I'm afraid my efforts to set up YouTube crashed today, so we'll have to put the meeting on YouTube a bit later. And Ton, would you like to close the meeting?
Yes, first of all, big thank you to Bart for willing to talk to us and dispense with his research and insights. A big thank you to our patrons who make all of this possible and who support us. And well, we can't thank our YouTube viewers today, but if you leave this on, thank you, YouTube, for viewers of the future. And I hope to see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A pleasure. Bye.